been a really interesting week in terms of what some very senior leaders have been saying. I'll talk about what Volodymyr Zelensky said in a second, but the MI6 chief in the UK, although he was speaking in France, said that Russia has launched a staggeringly reckless campaign of sabotage in Europe. He also says in his 37 years in intelligence, he's now head of MI6, he said that he has never seen a more dangerous world. Now we have Volodymyr Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine, saying that there could be a land for peace deal, suggested anyway, he's definitely softened his line, and saying that Ukraine, or even the rump Ukraine of what he controls, not talking about the Donbass region, not talking about Crimea, of course, which Russia currently controls, well, actually, if they were under some form of NATO protection or even a member of NATO, well, that would possibly be enough to end the war. This is a major intervention. It was done in an interview with Sky News. We'll play you a little bit of that in a second. But Mary Dejevsky, who is the foreign affairs columnist at The Independent, the doyen of foreign affairs analysis in this country. Mary, this is major, isn't it? This is seriously big, and it actually echoes a lot of the things we've been talking about over the last couple of years. And as Zelensky finally decided, actually, now President Trump is going to be president, things are going to change, let's get out ahead of it.
Well, I think it was very interesting. By complete chance, I was watching Zelensky's interview last night as it went out, and he was speaking in English. He was very forthright, and he was almost hyper in the way he was speaking. It was a very long interview. But in all that, I mean, I practically jumped out of my skin when I heard him talk about not just the possibility of diplomacy, but that he would be open to the idea of ceding the areas of Ukraine that Putin has occupied. And he limited that. He said, you know, on a temporary basis until they'll be given back. He also said that he wanted a NATO umbrella to cover the rest of Ukraine. Now, there are lots of questions that this raises, because
it's a question of what he actually means by NATO umbrella. Just hold that thought just for a second, Mary. Let's hear a little bit of what he said about NATO. As Mary correctly said, he gave some of the interview in English. Some of it was, his words are by a translator. I think in this clip, we hear the translator. Let's just play a little bit of what Zelensky has been saying to Sky News.
So, legally, by law, we have no right to recognize the occupied territory as territory of Russia. And here, we must not make any mistake. But if we want to stop the hot stage of the war, we should take under NATO umbrella the territory of Ukraine that we have under our control. That's what we need to do fast. And then Ukraine can get back the other part of its territory diplomatically.
I mean, we heard the translator there, Mary, but I think we need a translation of the translation. Can you translate for us?
Well, what we don't know is how far these two things are conditional in Zelensky's mind. Is the idea of ceding temporary control of the occupied areas to Russia, is that conditional on NATO providing, and it's very interesting what was said, not membership of NATO, but a NATO umbrella, so the protection rather than the actual formality of joining.
Because there are 32 countries within NATO, and all of them would have to consent to Ukraine becoming a member, and you can't join NATO, I think I'm right in saying, if you're at war.
Exactly. So there would have to be as it were, a separate condition for something called, that Zelensky calls an umbrella, that wouldn't be membership and that could cope with a country that was essentially divided or partly occupied. Now, when I was listening to the interview, it wasn't clear to me how far in Zelensky's mind these two things were conditional. What did strike me, the big change here, is the talk of ceding, albeit short-term, the control of those areas occupied by Russia. I have not heard him suggest any territorial concessions ever before now, and this is going to be one of the conditions if talks happen. Now, the problem is that if in Zelensky's mind these two things are conditional, he's going to run into big trouble with the Russians, because even a NATO umbrella rather than NATO membership, I don't think is going to be anywhere near acceptable to Russia. It's not even going to be negotiable.
Because that was one of the reasons Russia would say that it went to war in the first place.
Exactly. And that's why I don't think that anything short of neutrality is going to reach a peace agreement. But on the subject of temporarily ceding the land, there is actually, there's a possible precedent here in the way that the Western countries, including the UK, treated the Baltic states after the Second World War. They treated them as occupied territory, and they refused to recognize them diplomatically as part of the Soviet Union. Now, this actually made things incredibly simpler when the Soviet Union collapsed, because they could simply be fully recognized and said, well, we never actually didn't recognize the Baltics as independent states. So there is a sort of precedent there which makes it at least possible.
Yeah, it's fascinating, at least a possibility. What about the American aspect of all of this? Because we know that things are changing in regard to Trump. He's made things very clear. Tell us about General Kellogg as well and his potential role in all of this, because there are a lot of people who think that some of the appointments that Trump has put forward are perhaps not the most qualified people, but that is certainly not a charge you could make about Lieutenant General Kellogg.
No, and this is very, very interesting, because before his appointment was announced, there was a suggestion that Trump was going to be all out in favor of abandoning Ukraine. He was going to roll over in the direction of Moscow, and that the status quo in Ukraine would, as it were, with a Russian sort of victory, at least to a degree of Ukrainian territory, that this is what Trump was prepared to sign up for. The appointment of General Kellogg suggests that it's going to be more complicated, and that the US could be, under Trump, could be tougher on Russia and more supportive of Ukraine than was considered likely when Trump won the election. So we'll just have to wait and see. But I think, you know, when Trump talks about ending the war, or at least starting to bring the war to an end within 24 hours, it's quite clear that he and his advisors, and General Kellogg in particular, they have thoughts about this, and it's going to be very, very interesting how far they can persuade not just Zelensky, but Putin as well.
Mary, thank you for that analysis, and I just want to tell you that Jason in the Lake District has been in touch to say Mary Dejevsky is just different gravy. She's the most knowledgeable person I've ever heard speak about the situation. There we are. I agree with you, Jason.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mary. That's Mary Dejevsky there, Foreign Affairs columnist at The Independent.